So good morning. This morning, I have the privilege to welcome Andrés Rodríguez-Pose, one of the leading and the most well-known scholars in the field of regional science. Andrés is the Princesa de Asturias Chair and the Professor of Economic Geography at the London School of Economics. He's also the director of the Cañada Blanche Center of the London School of Economics. He was awarded in 2018 the ERSA Prize in Regional Science, and he has been a holder of an ERC Advanced Grant and of a prestigious Royal Society Wolfson Research Merit Award. Andrés is an editor of Economic Geography, but most of all, he published several famous books and articles on various topics of regional science. So you all know him, of course. He's very famous. And tomorrow and today, he will speak about a new topic, brand new topic, which is about Alone or Lonely, the economic cost of solitude. That's an essay of this topic. So Andrés, the floor is you now.
Well, thank you very much, André, and thank you very much for inviting me to give this keynote at ERSA. It feels good to be back in this community. I wish it was in person, but I want to congratulate all the organizers at ERSA for having such a successful online congress, something that is very difficult in these days. It also felt good to get up this morning and wear a suit. I think out of respect to the people in ERSA, the people that I've been in this community for such a long time, for my whole, let's say, professional and academic career, to see them and to see all of you, albeit virtually. And as André has said, I'm going to try to talk today about a topic that's new. For many years, I've been asked now to give talks about how to make a successful presentation. And one of the key recommendations I always give is never, ever, when you're doing an important presentation, such a keynote, do it for the first time, do a new topic. Just do something that you have already done and is well done and is well trained. But I don't seem to practice what I preach. And in recent years, I seem to take the risks and do something that in this case has become extremely risky because it's a topic that is completely new for me. And it is a topic that the paper was more or less finished at about 10:30 last night. And this presentation was finished at about 3 in the morning also. So hopefully it'll go well, but I cannot guarantee anything. However, I'm not the only one responsible for the presentation, and I'm going to share my screen. This is a joint work with Chiara Burlina from the Gran Sasso Science Institute, the GSSI in L'Aquila in Italy, who should be among the audience and would be as responsible as I am. So sorry, Chiara, for any shortcomings that you see in the presentation. All right, so let me just start with the topic Alone and Lonely, or Alone or Lonely. We struggled with the title, and the economic costs of solitude for regions in Europe. And one of the things I want to highlight is that it has been the rise of solitude has been an increasing problem, and it has become very evident for most of us during the pandemic. During this COVID pandemic, many of us, wherever we are in Europe or in other parts of the world, have had to endure significant lockdowns. Very often, many of you would have been in those lockdowns alone at home, and very often, as a result of that, feeling lonely. But the rise of solitude is not something that has happened overnight, that started with the pandemic. It has been going on for quite a few decades, and it has been traced back by many people to the 1970s, mid-1970s, late 1960s, in which there had been a rise of, on the one hand, people living alone, but also on the other hand, people that felt more and more lonely. But when we're talking about solitude, this is not a univocal concept. It has many dimensions and many facets. And probably the two most important ones are the rise in people living alone, so what we can call alone living, people that live in one single person household. And the second one, which is the rise in loneliness. So the rise in people that feel isolated from the rest, that feel sometimes depressed, that sometimes feel desperate because or incapable in many ways of connecting with others. So these are two dimensions that are very well captured by, let's say, Germanic languages. We can make easily a distinction between being alone and being lonely, or if we do it in German, we can make the distinction between being allein and also being einsam. If, like me, your mother tongue is a Romance language, it becomes a bit more difficult to make the distinction because we struggle with words. Although there's solitario or solitaire, we use, for example, in Italian or in Spanish, we use solo, or we use seul in French, which makes us struggle a bit more with the concept. But these are two factors. The more physical one, the factor of alone living, so being living on one person in one person households, with a more emotional one, which is the one of being lonely and isolated, feeling isolated from others, that have been rising and have been rising significantly in recent decades. Just looking at loneliness, for example, Carl Burgas-Yasta in 2010 already highlighted that in the developed world, especially in the Western world, there was an epidemic of loneliness. So how can we distinguish between those two? Traditionally, when we think about alone living, or when most research about alone living, imagine this type of person. It was mostly connected to people in their old age. And it was not something that was desired, that was by choice. It was something that came as a result of the circumstances. Very often, people that had been in long marriages or partnerships, and then one of the members of that marriage, normally the husband, died, and then you ended up with people living alone in their old age, and very often, especially women, in precarious economic circumstances. But this is something that has changed in recent decades. Increasingly, people live alone not because they're forced to or because of the circumstances. They increasingly live alone because they choose to do so. And the profile and the age profile has changed. They tend to be young adults. They tend to be far more educated on average. They tend to be young professionals. And increasingly what we see is that women are the ones that make the largest group of this professionals. So these are people with high levels of education and also with permanent jobs. I hesitate to use the word because I think that my grandmother, who actually worked from home, was highly empowered, but what we will call now empowered women. And there has been a significant rise of living alone. A lot of studies have focused on the US, where around, and especially in cities, 40% of young adults live alone. And in fact, when you look at the figures, a large share, 41% of those between the age of 25 and 34 living alone had already a minimum of a bachelor's degree, if not a higher level of education, and 2/3 had a permanent full-time job. These are people that are highly capable of affording, let's say, the rent and also of contributing to the economy. In Europe, the phenomenon is still a bit less widespread, although with significant differences across the continent, as we're going to see. And what we are seeing is that 32.5% of all households in 2016 actually, were single households with one person. And it was already the largest household group, bigger than those of two persons, and was the fastest growing group with a significant growth in the last decade. When we map this at the regional level, we find an important geographical divide. There's a far higher level of alone living in the north, mainly in the Nordic countries, in the case of the European Union, in Finland, in Sweden, and in Denmark. Also a high prevalence in most of the, let's say, center and Western countries, all the way from the Czech Republic to Germany, to the UK and France, and a much lower prevalence for those countries where we got all the data in the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain, in many countries of Eastern Europe, like Poland, and to a lesser extent Hungary, and I suppose it's the same case in other southern countries, like, for example, Italy and Greece. We can also see a strong geographical divide and rural-urban divide, in which a much higher share of in large cities. You can see there that the prevalence is more than 40% in places like Amsterdam, Bremen, Hamburg, Copenhagen, Berlin, London, and it's far lower in smaller towns, medium-sized cities, and in rural regions. And there's an important national factor in which what you have is a strong national borders that are in evidence, separating, for example, France from Spain or Germany from Poland, which may in many cases be related to the educational and employment systems in place. Also, maybe family traditions are a factor. The case of what is known as the Italian vitellone, men in their 30s that still live with their parents, which is not an uncommon phenomenon in other Mediterranean and southern countries. Measuring loneliness, the other dimension of solitude that we are considering, is a bit more difficult. Why? Because most studies of loneliness come from the psychological and, to a lesser extent, the sociological dimension. There's much less on the geography of loneliness. And traditionally, these studies use what is known as the UCLA loneliness scale, which is very good for individuals, but has never been applied at an aggregate territorial level, like we're doing in this paper. So Kiara and I, what we had to do was to create a new index, which we have called the sociability index, but we could have easily called the loneliness index, although the term was a bit perhaps too negative, so we stuck with sociability index. And what we do here is we measure the frequency of meetings with friends, relatives, and co-workers outside the household, coming from the European Social Survey that does it on 2-year intervals, and we aggregate them at the regional level to produce a map, which you're seeing at the moment, and I'm going to show you in more detail now, in which what we find is that there's a strong national differences within countries, in contrast to what we were seeing with alone living, which were national systems. We can see that, for example, there's significant differences within countries like Spain or Poland or Sweden or Germany, in which you had high levels of sociability. For example, in Schleswig-Holstein, you had far lower levels of sociability, for example, in Hessen, in Bavaria, or in Baden-Württemberg. There was also higher sociability as a whole in parts of the south, in the Iberian Peninsula, in Portugal and in Spain, that lead the way in this respect, but also very high levels of sociability in countries like the UK and in most parts of Sweden or even Finland, and strong, significant differences within countries, as I mentioned before. And in contrast to what we were seeing with alone living, there's no clear and discernible urban-rural divide or big city, small city town pattern. You can say that, for example, in some rural areas of, more rural areas of Spain or Portugal, like the Alentejo or Extremadura, there's a high sociability level, but in other parts of Europe, there are very high levels of sociability in places like, for example, Brussels or Stockholm, for example, in comparison to other parts of the country. And that was the aggregate, but when you look more in detail and you look at the percentage of people that have meetings on a daily basis or a weekly basis or monthly basis, etc., and you look at percentages and you aggregate them geographically, what we find is this sort of maps that we do for every period, every year covered in the analysis. And I'm going to make the contrast and focus the contrast in between those that have daily meetings and those that have, where we put never is actually people that declare that they never or virtually never meet other people outside their household. And what we find that in the case of daily meetings, there's a high concentration, again, throughout Portugal, in Spain, many parts of southern France, and strong contrast between the south of France and the north of France. In many areas of Spain, Portugal, and southern France, what you have is that more than 30% of the population meet people outside the household on a daily basis, but it's not just an exclusive southern phenomenon. If you want, in a country like Sweden, you have areas, including some of the highly populated, most densely populated areas of the country, where you find that the percentages are relatively similar. Is there an urban-rural divide? For example, in the case of Spain, what you find here is that the lowest meetings perhaps happen in those places where you have the highest percentage of people living alone, like, for example, Madrid, the biggest agglomeration in the country, surrounded by areas where daily meetings are far more frequent. But this is not always the case. As I said before, I mentioned Brussels or I mentioned Stockholm. Here you have very high levels of daily meetings, or the population, percentage of the population that meets or claims to meet people outside the household daily. Once we go into weekly meetings, monthly meetings, the percentages decline until they're lowest at, unfortunately, in my point of view, for those that claim that never meet, in which it's always or almost always across all regions, consider 139 regions in Europe, below the 5% threshold, with one clear exception, which is in Hungary, where it's far more prevalent, with areas in which it goes up to more than 25% of people claiming that they never meet anyone outside their household. As I said, there's a rural-urban divide, or more evidence of a rural-urban divide, but nuance, and many big cities are actually places where people also engage and network actively outside the household, so therefore preventing that sort of loneliness in the way we define loneliness. So if we put both things together, do they go hand in hand? And the geography already hints and that they might not be the same. Fortunately, there are not a lot of people that are alone and lonely, or there's a lot of prevalence of areas where there's a high incidence, to be more precise, of people living alone, and people that could be considered as being lonely because of lack of interaction with others. What seems to be the norm is that there are a lot of people that are sociable and remain in company, or perhaps that they live alone but are sociable. According to studies that have been developed for the United States, for example, in the case of Kleinenberg, it's been highlighted that many of these adults that choose to live alone, they compensate with respect to people that live within bigger households by being more sociable, by networking more online and networking in person. And there are also not a lot of people that are lonely, but not alone, so that they feel alone within bigger households. And when we look at the correlation at a regional level between these two dimensions of solitude, the share of individuals living alone, and the regional sociability index, what we find is that there's virtually no correlation. You have the regression line over here. It has a relatively negative slope, meaning that in places where you have more people living alone, you tend to have a lower level of sociability in general, but on the whole, the line is relatively flat, and most of you can see the dots over here, which are for the different years consider and for the different regions consider, imply at a relationship that is non-significant, that there's a very limited correlation. If more people live alone and more people are lonely, this is likely to have economic consequences. But in contrast to the copious literature on the causes of loneliness and living alone, there's very, very little. And this is something that most people coming at this from a psychological or a sociological, most researchers coming from those perspectives into solitude, acknowledge there's very little about the potential economic consequences of solitude, and there's very little or almost nothing about the aggregate, so the macroeconomic consequences of having increasing shares of alone living and increasing shares of people feeling lonely. So what about alone living? Here, most of the analysis or past analysis looking at alone living have been focusing on the idea that it was caused by economic hardship, that it was, as I said before, the result of changes in status linked to widowhood, linked to processes of divorce, loss of kin, that was actually forced upon the individual and not something that was done by choice, and that most of the time happened in old age when people were retired or less productive from an economic point of view. And that was likely to have, on aggregate, a negative impact on economic terms. But increasingly, as it has become more and more clear that being alone is something that happens by choice, in adulthood, to highly educated women, and not just women, but also men that tend to be professionals, the impact of living alone might not be negative. It actually might be positive, and it might be positive because it allows people to make a choice to have quality time for themselves, to have more quality time at work, and to be able to choose when they socialize and when they don't socialize, when they relate to others, when they network and when they do not network. And as a result, it should be connected to greater growth. But when we do the connection individually of the two factors, the share of individuals living alone and the growth of GDP per capita, we find that the correlation is actually almost, as in the previous case, non-existent. There's very, very little link between both factors. When we go into loneliness, here seems to be far more agreement. The idea that it tends to be linked to far lower economic activity. People that are, or in the way we define, feel lonely, that they see less people, they tend to have more health problems, more health issues. They tend to very often suffer from depression. There's a lot of research that has connected it to premature deaths by suicide, but also because of the aggravation of other very often previous conditions. And also in a discipline like that of economic geography, in which we have made quite a lot of the importance of, let's say, interaction and networking and buzz as a factor for the generation and diffusion of new knowledge, the lower the exchanges, the lower the interchanges, the lower the networking by a large percentage of the population, that has an implications for knowledge generation and for the diffusion of that knowledge, which has a potential very negative impact on the on economic development. And the upsides are limited. I mean, there are some people that highlight that people sometimes choose to be not to meet others and be lonely, if you want to define it this way, to find some peace and quiet for concentration, for reflection. But in general, the downsides are clearly stronger than the upsides. And what we find is that there should be a lower connection, or that loneliness should be connected to lower growth at an aggregate level. If you have a high share of people feeling lonely, you should grow less in this case, your region. Again, we do the correlation, and we find that individually the correlation is very limited. So if we find no strong individual correlations between our variables of interest and our dependent variable, it might be that loneliness and alone living may have an influence over economic trajectories of regions at an aggregate level once we introduce other factors within an econometric analysis that may affect the evolution and the economic performance of regions. But having said that, taking into account the theory, we formulate a few hypotheses, 3 hypotheses to be more precise. First, we assume that lower levels of sociability in a region, a higher percentage of people being or feeling lonely will result in lower economic activity and therefore lower economic growth for that region. That This might depend, it might not be a linear relationship, that there might be too much or too little sociability. And then if you interact too much or you interact too little, this is likely to have a negative impact for economic growth, that there might be a threshold in which frequent but not overwhelmingly frequent meetings are the ones that drive innovation, when you have time to interact, to network, but you also have time to think, you also have time to reflect, you also have time to work on your new ideas and become more productive. And then finally, that in principle, the drive towards living alone in a region, the higher the share of people in single households is likely to be connected to higher levels of growth, especially taking into account that this growth has happened mainly among young professionals. So in principle, living alone is going to lead to greater development. Feeling lonely might link, in most cases, with some exceptions, to lower development. But what are the real economic consequences of solitude? And Kiara and I have done the analysis for getting data on these topics is not always easy. We've done it for 139 regions in 13 European countries, covering data, as I mentioned before, on economic growth, our dependent variable, our variables of interest, which are the two dimensions of solitude, alone living and loneliness. And we have a series of controls that are other factors: education, GDP per capita, age groups, government quality, levels of development, and overall GDP that might affect economic growth at a regional level, according to the literature. And we use it for the period R. We cover the period between 2011 and 2017 using a Hausman-Taylor estimation. And we use a Hausman-Taylor because, unfortunately, for elderly population and for alone living, we only have 1 year coming from the Silk survey data set. And these are factors that change very slowly over time, in contrast to, for example, economic growth. So what results do we get? Well, the first one, and confirming one of our hypotheses, is that when you have a higher share of people that are sociable in a society, when you have a lower share of lonely individuals, regions in Europe, once you control for other factors, grow significantly more. So loneliness seems to be, as expected and told by the literature on individual outcomes, economic outcomes of loneliness, highly detrimental for economic growth in Europe during the period of analysis at a regional level. When we look at the share of individuals living alone, by contrast, we find that the connection with economic growth is positive and significant, and highly positive and significant for that sake. It's a very, very strong result in whichever way we do the analysis, in which the share of individuals living alone is linked to a far greater level of economic growth in Europe once you control for other factors. And another factor that comes as very strong is that aging societies, so regions that have a higher percentage of people aging, are less capable of growing. But where these results actually confirm the main expectations about the two dimensions of solitude, we wanted to look at more specifically at the prevalence of certain types of, let's say, sociability, certain types of loneliness, certain degrees, if you want, of loneliness, looking at the share of the population that meets on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, less than once per month, and those that claim that they never meet one another, with the expectation that this relationship is not going to be linear in any particular way. And what we find is that, in contrast to what we expected, if you have a small share, because they're never big with the exception of parts of Hungary, of the population that claims not to meet other people, mostly never, call them nerds, call them geeks in person, it might not be that bad for growth. In fact, what we find is that, albeit the coefficient is not very strong, we have a positive and significant and positive coefficient that is significant at the 10% level. The same Well, I'm going to go to the next one. The same applies when when the meetings are daily. So when people, when you have a high share of people that meet on a daily basis with outside their household, with friends, with other relatives, with co-workers, when you have far too frequent meetings, if you want to qualify this like that, the benefits of that interaction might disappear. And in fact, when I meet, I am, after all, a Spaniard. I tend to meet people, I would say, on a daily basis. And most of my conversations turn around sport. It's not that it's going to make myself, or it's pleasant enough, but it's not going to make myself highly productive in any sort of way in that respect. And there seems to be an ideal level of meetings with us when in regions where you have a higher share of the population, or a high share of the population that actually has weekly or more than weekly meetings, but not daily meetings. And this seems to be connected to higher levels of growth. In all cases, we control for the share of individuals living alone. And here the coefficient, in whichever way we look at it, remains positive and highly significant, meaning that in regions with a high level of people living alone, once we control for population density, we control for big cities, etc., the correlation is always positive and significant. So more people living alone, a higher share of people living alone, the higher the level of growth. So what can we conclude? Because I know that I'm reaching my half an hour allocated, and what are the policy implications that come from this? Well, the first one is that living alone may not be bad for economic growth. If people who live alone keep a healthy social life, and most indications highlight that a large percentage of the people living alone from this psychological and sociological literature actually compensate through keeping more networks, more meetings with friends, more relationships that are very often not just local, but also connected through the use of telematics and the use of digital systems and social media. What you have is this can lead to a healthy sort of composition in terms of economic growth. Places where you have a lot of people living alone, but these people are able to connect, they are not isolated, tend to be far more dynamic than people where these places where these people are less prevalent or absent. By contrast, not living alone, but in this case, loneliness will be bad, or can be bad, for economic growth. If you have people that feel lonely, this is going to have implications in terms of having more health problems, greater levels of depression, less capability of engaging and generating new ideas, less capability of networking, and you end up in situations whereby, in the end, if there is a high share of the population, that might affect aggregate economic performance for the region. But of course, if there's a share of the population that chooses to be alone, maybe it's not that bad. Even in the case of loneliness, you have that a certain percentage, as I said, of nerds and geeks might be needed, people that remain in their offices all the time, or their rooms more than offices all the time, and interact with their computers, or if they interact with anyone, they interact just telematically and never in person. So that might be not that bad for the economy. And sometimes too much meetings, too frequent meetings, for example, that lead to needless chit chat, to exchanges that go nowhere, may not be good for an economy. That you need to find a balance in which the meetings are not just fulfilling from a personal point of view, but also contribute or help contribute to dynamizing individual economic activity, and as a result, in aggregate levels, the economic activity of the whole region. So what policies can we do? I mean, I hesitate to say that if we're going to give some policy advice, that we can give any policy advice. First, because this is a preliminary analysis, but also because this is a clear personal dimension in which very often it might be difficult for governments in any way to intervene. So first, it is not clear whether there's a need to intervene in any way. But in terms of alone living, this is probably something that should not be discouraged. If anything, it could be encouraged, but it's going to happen anyway. And most people that are doing it at the moment are doing it not just because of choice, but they are doing it because they can. So perhaps there might be some governments, especially in those countries where there are significant limitations for people living alone. And I'm thinking about countries in the southern rim of Europe, where through family solidarity or family systems, etc., most young people stay with their parents for a very, very long time after they reach adulthood in many cases, that perhaps there's a need to support in those extreme cases the idea of alone living and encourage people to afford, let's say, for example, rents and move out and lead their own life rather than stay with their parents until they can live from their children, as is the case in many parts of Southern Europe. And there should be also a more targeted fight against loneliness, which means fundamentally addressing the roots rather than the consequences, targeting the factors that lead to people feeling lonely, because it's going to have significant, not just economic benefits, but also is going to address a lot of perhaps far more important problems related to individual and collective health, well-being, and social conditions, without interfering and respecting those that want to be alone, because of course there will be always a certain share of the population that wants to be alone and very often prefers to keep it that way. So having said that, I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I'll be very happy to try to answer any questions that you might have on this presentation. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Andrés. It was very, very interesting and very, very inspiring talk, living alone and loneliness, and about the benefits and the problems of sociability in terms of exchange, in terms of interactions, but also in terms of physical or mental health. So you addressed all those topics. And of course, there are a lot of questions in the chat. So I'm not sure we could take all those questions, but we will take a screen and you will have them in the end. So I start immediately to ask one of these questions, and it's about the question of the discrepancy between the actual level of loneliness and the desired level of loneliness by Daniel Montegal. They call this discrepancy, and not loneliness per se, have a negative impact on economic growth? That's the second question on the chat.
No, thank you very much, Daniele. I think this is a very, very interesting question, and one that needs to be studied in greater detail. The psychological literature makes a clear distinction between forced loneliness and desired or loneliness by choice. In this case, it's more about, rather than loneliness, is about living alone. The only thing is that in an empirical analysis like ours, and that's bound to have a difference. If you have a desired loneliness, or you have a desire, wish to live alone, which are two different dimensions of solitude, probably the impact on the economy is, in the worst case scenario, is neutral, both at the individual level and at the collective level. In the best case scenario is going to be positive or highly positive. If that loneliness is forced, or that living alone is forced because of the circumstances, because you lose your partner and therefore you remain alone in old age, the economic impact individually is going to be negative. You had that a lot of the literature, past literature on alone living, was fundamentally highlighted the duress, the difficulties that many of these people, economic duress, but also social and psychological, that many of those people experience. So they were people that were alone and lonely. And then you're going to have a significant negative impact at the individual level, but also on aggregate terms. Having said that, this is an empirical analysis, and I'm afraid at the moment we don't have the way of getting the data on this distinction between, let's say, desired or sought after solitude and forced solitude. If we were to have it, it would make for I would say, a far more interesting study, And I would encourage you and everyone else that is interested in this topic, because it's becoming a very, very prevalent topic, to actually delve into it and try to think about ways of trying to make that distinction. One way would be to look at solitude by age groups, which at the moment we may have data for living alone. We don't have data for loneliness, but there's something that deserves far greater attention, and we need to try to highlight it in order to be able to get our hands on those sorts of information.
So thank you, Andrés. There is a quite related question about about trust. So the question is, what about trust? You would expect more frequent social interactions to reflect a higher stock of urban regional trust. And then, okay, what it means, maybe you can exchange without trust or with trust. So does it entail your demonstration?
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan. I think this is, again, trust and social capital is something that I've been working quite a lot. I mean, I get very often in previous research at regional level, research that I conducted with Jonathan Moringani and Rune Fitjar at the University of Stavanger. We look at trust, we look at social capital. We tend to get far stronger relationship between social capital and trust, although sometimes they're highly correlated. In this case, when we started the analysis, we considered trust as a variable. We included it as a control variable, and it came out with no significant results, and we chucked it out. Why? Perhaps because we considered that, and this is just speculation, and there might be a need to study more. We considered that the level of, let's say, interaction, the frequency of meeting other people outside the household was possibly highly correlated with trust, which in the data, it didn't come as a highly correlated variable, but probably people who very often network with others on a daily basis or on a weekly basis with a certain frequency are probably more trusting than those people that claim to never or less than once a month meet others outside the household. But as I said, this is something that should be considered in greater detail. We just did it very, very quickly and never went in depth into that sort of analysis, but it's something that needs to be analyzed in greater detail, and not just the relationship between all forms of solitude and trust, but all the forms of solitude and all types of institutions, not just informal, but also formal institutions.
Okay, thank you. There are also two more technical questions. If I said, I will take them together. One is about the possibility of a revised causation between growth and tendency to be alone by Evgeny Kuznetsov, and another by Isabelle Thomas about the thing that the data aggregation level could highly impact the results in maps and regressions.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm going to start with Evgeny's question about reverse causation. There seems to be and we have demonstrated a connection between, on the one hand, living alone and economic growth. Now the question is whether greater economic growth leads to a bigger tendency to living alone. And in more developed societies, there's a bigger, in cities that tend to be richer, there's a bigger share of the population that lives alone. So maybe also the causation runs in both directions. Having said that, I'm going to first say, well, we haven't done the causality analysis at this case for two reasons. First, because this is preliminary and we wanted to just explore a topic that hasn't been actually dealt with. And second, because I'm not that really concerned about causality in this case. I'm not really concerned about causality in most cases, but this is my point of view. I think we need to understand all relationships. And of course, if, let's say, more people living alone leads to greater growth and we need to understand why that happens. But if that then in turn leads to to more people living alone, then we also need to understand, and we need to go one step at a time, and perhaps very often advance 2 or 3 steps together in trying to make sure that we don't discard these relationships. After all, this is social science. This is humans living in society, in territories. This is not a lab. And we're not going to be able to get a perfect causation because everything is going to be related with everything. So I think rather than trying to say, well, is one prevalent of the other, try to understand why this happens and what are the factors, what are the exact mechanisms through which this happens, in which it would be more interesting. On Isabel's question, the aggregation, one of the main problems is that we are using surveys, and surveys that have a limited number of people per region. In some cases, for example, in the European Social Survey, we are dealing with an average of about 550 people per region, persons per region that have been surveyed. In some other cases, in the worst case scenario, we go down to about 200. That creates problems because we are aggregating based on a very small sample, which may or may not be representative. They claim to be representative of the population. They might be representative at the national level, not at the regional level. And of course, making the transition between the micro and the macro generates a problem. Having said that, for lack of data, I think it's better to take the risk of aggregation, which in my case, looking at the maps, I think it does work, rather than just wait until we get better data, because otherwise we will not be able to we will only be able to make very, very limited progress.
Thank you, Andrés. There is a question from Federica Rossi, which tackles the question of the type of interaction at a distance or face-to-face interaction. So the question is, for the sociability index, you use the frequency of meetings with friends, relatives, and co-workers. But what about the virtual meetings? So the use of technology to keep in touch.
Well, in principle, the meetings are in person. The meetings outside the household in person, with co-workers outside the office, with relatives that are not relatives that live with you, and with friends that do not share the same household. So that is the type of meetings that we are measuring. We know nothing. And I mean, there would be a lot to be said about the virtual meetings, because probably a lot of people that say that they never meet anyone, all these nerds and geeks, are not just hermits that live like, well, the hermits of the 3rd century or the 5th century after Christ, and live in a hole and never talk to anyone and vow to never talk. These are people that are always in front of a computer, especially if they're young, connected and meeting other people online, but hardly ever, if not, if they claim to, in many cases, that it's never in person. And a lot of the literature on this has highlighted that social media meetings, digital meetings actually compensate for this lack of relationship. I am not sure. I've been now for a year and a half, like most of you, doing virtual meetings as a substitute for in-person. I still miss in-person meetings, but nevertheless, I do miss them a lot. But nevertheless, for many people, it might be a next to perfect substitute, or even better than a substitute. And a lot of this literature highlights that these meetings actually play an important role in making these people living alone, for example, or even perhaps, although there's less literature on that, people feeling lonely, much more connected and integrated in society. This is something that would be worth studying. So is there a difference between in-person meetings and virtual meetings, especially as the pandemic has highlighted that virtual meetings that were already very important before have become far more prevalent, and for many people, they have become dominant relative to in-person meetings. But at the moment, this is something that I can only speculate. And as I said with previous questions, we need more people to work on this, and we need more people to answer questions that are very valid, but for which we still have no answers.
Thank you, Andrés. There is a quite traditional question on COVID-19 now, because we have all this question in all conferences now, and it's asked by, but it's pertinent, it's asked by Ilaria Mariotti, and it's about the comparison of the data before the COVID-19 pandemic and during. So she said the issue to feeling lonely enhance the growth of co-working spaces, remote workers, and also all this question of the so-called exile of the urban people and also of the problem of remote working and so on?
Thanks, Ilaria. This is what I would have liked to do. Unfortunately, our data finishes in 2016, and we cannot go. 2017, and we cannot go beyond that at the moment. It would be good, because what we are getting from this analysis and empirical analysis of what has happened in the past is probably a preview of what may have happened, what is likely to happen in the post-COVID-19 world. We know that more people in solitude, more people feeling alone and living lonely has implications for economic development. Now that they don't always go in the same direction. But the COVID-19 pandemic has thrust this into a completely different dimension. So the share of people that are probably feel alone is far greater than what it was in 2017 right now. And probably the share of people that are going to live alone is going to increase, although it was already increasing very, very fast. What we are going to say, we can say, is that what we experienced before the pandemic is an indication that we're probably likely to end up with a far more polarized society, not just at an individual level, but also from a territorial level after the pandemic. But we need to get our hands on data and information about what's happening during the pandemic. And of course, the data at the moment are changing every day, in order to make sure that what we are experiencing is not something that has been completely altered by COVID-19, but that COVID-19, like in my view, in many other territorial and economic phenomena, is actually pushing transformations that were already underway to a whole new level, to a whole new dimension.
Thank you, Andrés. There are two questions, but are not related, but they are on the technical side. And they ask the question of let's say, the European size of your work. That's a question by Evgeny about a possible selection bias due to the European marriage compared to Asian countries. And also a question of Pietro somewhat about the people that want to live alone but can't afford to do that. So they would love to do that in the end. They couldn't.
Okay. No, I think I'll start with the last one, which is very much related to Daniela's question, which is forced alone living and desired alone living, but also in this case of Evgeny's question, it would be forced living with others and unforced living with others. There's a lot of literature on the equivalent of the vita alone, the people, especially men, living with their parents until late in their 30s or 40s, even sometimes beyond they get married in parts of Southern Europe. Most of it conducted at an individual level, but most of it is not on the economic consequences of that. There would be a need to look in far greater detail at an aggregate level for, let's say, regions of cities or across many parts of Europe. Because as I mentioned, I highlighted in my policy conclusions, this might have a negative implication for economic development on top of a lot of other sociological and psychological sort of consequences that need to be tackled. Having said that, we need to have far better data than we have at the moment at subnational level on these issues. Because I suspect that if you're forced to stay, let's say with your parents, you're forced to stay in households where you don't want to stay, mainly because you cannot afford a divorce or for whatever other reasons, that has important impacts that might affect other dimensions of loneliness. In this case, you might feel more lonely, you might feel more isolated from others, and also might have health implications and might have significant economic implications, both at the individual and at the aggregate level. On the question of marriage, that's the first thing we looked at, share of marriage people, and it came out not non-significant, in fact, non-significant in any way we put it in the case of Europe. And we took it out from the analysis, as we did with other variables that came out as non-significant in any type of analysis we did. And then we went the one that it was all obliterated by age. Age was a far more important factor in terms of affecting this level of economic growth and age composition. What about other parts of the world? There's very, very little, or there's virtually nothing at aggregate level on solitude and economic development. In fact, I think we are pioneers in this. So we are just putting a marker for Europe. But even if you look at the case of the US, where most of the literature on solitude comes from, and there's a lot of very detailed individual level analysis, microanalysis, what you find is that most of it does not deal with even the individual economic consequences. They talk about duress, they talk about hardship, but nothing more than that. And at aggregate level, especially in places where long-term economic decline has also led to high levels of depression, ill health, etc., there's much less concentrating on the aggregate level. How is that doing for cities? I don't think there's anything on Asian countries or any other part of the world. So there's a massive open field for either you, Evgeny, or anyone who wants to go into it. And please let me know, because I'll be very happy to try to collaborate if I can.
Okay, there are a lot of questions in the chat, and I think we don't be able to take all of them, so I will cherry pick some of them. And I think that there is an interesting question about the indicators by Filippo Bertomecocci, and he raised the things. So you make a correlation with regional growth, but you could also have taken maybe some other indicators like happiness indicators or this kind of things, because this huge debate around GDP and growth now.
Absolutely. Yes, I completely agree. We took growth because it was the one we had and the easiest, and but well-being, happiness, or subjective well-being, if you want, health issues, and overall health of the population linked to people living alone or people feeling lonely. Those are as important, if not more important, than looking just at economic outcomes. And even within economic outcomes, you can look at participation in the labor force, employment, productivity, because innovation, it might have a lot of dimensions. We have, as I said, just put the first marker on this, saying we need to pay attention to this, because this is important. And this is, as Hilaria was saying, going to be even much more important after the pandemic. So I'm not saying that the dependent variable we're using is the only one. I think it's an important one. It's a fundamental one, but there are other dependent variables that are as crucial and that need to be explored, because if you want, this epidemic of solitude, this epidemic of loneliness that was highlighted already by the Lancet in 2010, is something that is not going to go away, that is growing and is going to grow far more, and is going to have significant implications, economic, social, health, across all layers of society and across all regions in Europe and other parts of the world. Okay.
Thank you very much, Andrés. I think we are close to the end now. We have to finish. I'm really sorry, because there are a lot of interesting questions in the chat, but we are short of time now. We will be cut soon. So thank you very much for this very, 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 very inspiring presentation, and also for the links you put there. There are a lot of interesting questions could be raised, for example, about the question of social distancing, because the question of social distancing is crucial during the pandemic, but also you raise this question in different ways, because we need that social distancing is maybe a part of our modern societies, but now we have to close. So thank you very much. And now we are waiting for the very, very interesting papers to come, hopefully.
Well, thank you very much, Andrés, for the invitation, and thank you very much to everyone and to the whole ERSA community. And I hope that next year we'll have not just a virtual meeting in order to overcome our loneliness and our alone living in our own houses. We'll be able to also meet in person and not just keep social distancing, but also hug and kiss as we have done in the past.
So thank you very much, Andrés. Thank you, everybody, to have attended. You were so numerous there. So bye-bye and see you to the next session. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.